Some of my art ideas are meant to have a meaning, but Impossible Chase was just meant to be fun. The interesting thing is that it ended up being meaningful to me anyway because of how it influenced the way I think about achieving goals. Now, I usually have a fair idea of where a picture will end up, so I can start with a basic version of it already in my head. For example, I knew that sloth darts would have a sloth and a dartboard, and the best way to see them both clearly would be from the side. The rest was all about figuring out the details and the lighting. Strange Safari wasn't quite as clear to me, but I still knew I'd have a small group of iconic African animals with swapped around skins. I just had to choose the animals and try to arrange everything in a way that was enjoyable to look at. Now, suppose having a specific plan is probably a good idea outside of the art world as well, like with baking a cake or designing an aeroplane, and just about anything where there's an end result that you're trying to achieve. But this project made me start thinking that maybe some goals can be figured out as we go along, just by solving one problem at a time. You probably still need a general direction, which in this case was an idea inspired by a sewer chase in an old film noir movie called The Third Man. The chase had lots of angles that reminded me of some illusion drawings by M.C. Escher. The main problem was that there were probably 1,000 ways to do what I call an Escher noir, and I had no idea how to put it all together. So the first problem was, of course, where do I start? Well, with a picture based on characters, a character is usually a good starting point. A criminal could stand out nicely because he could be brightly lit by a police officer's electric torch, whereas the officer would have to be in shadow and hard to see. So where do I put the criminal? The centre would be a good place for attracting attention, but it would also force me to squish everything else around him. So I put him at the edge to keep the space open. So what angle should he be at in a picture where any direction can be up or down? I decided to put him the right way up so people wouldn't think the picture was accidentally hung up at the wrong angle. Plus he could be something familiar for people to connect with before checking out the crazy stuff. Now I realised that not every picture needs both genders, but in this case I tried adding a female character and I was immediately happy with it, because two characters imply a relationship, and a relationship creates a story. Another element was to have the characters looking into the picture at the person chasing them, because we tend to look where other people are looking, which in this case leads us into the picture instead of out of it. My actual thinking process was probably a lot less organised than that, but I still got to that first sketch pretty quickly, which gave me a good launching point. The tricky part was everything else. I just started throwing things in there, all at different angles, with no real direction except to make each part different from the rest, to have as much variety and interest as I could fit in without making it all a big mess. Then I added some basic shading to get a sense of how it would all look, but it just didn't feel right. So of course I ignored that feeling and wasted some time trying to rescue the picture, but eventually I decided to scrap it. A big issue was the fact that it was more like a collage of different pictures stuck together than one unified scene, and the key to that was the perspective. Everything was operating on a different perspective, which I just made up as I went along, as if I'd taken a bunch of photos from different angles and distances and shoved it all together, instead of one point of view of a single environment where everything was connected. So, time for sketch 2. You can see the two main characters are still at the bottom left, and they're still looking roughly into the picture instead of out of it, plus there's a guy on a walkway in the middle, but everything else is very different from the previous version. This time the sketch was all built on a single unified perspective. Although I'll let you in on a little secret, the perspective is completely faked. I had a vague idea that M.C. Escher had sometimes used parallel lines instead of the usual converging perspective lines to make impossible things possible and still look believable. I decided to use the same trick, but I still wanted to create the illusion of distance, so I had a distinct foreground, middle ground, and background, and made the characters and architecture in each section smaller as they went back. I realised later that the whole parallel line thing was completely unnecessary, since Impossible Chase was all about gravity, not perspective illusions at all, but I think it still turned out fine. In terms of the various bits and pieces around the picture, I don't remember why I added all of those particular things in, although the electric torch at the top right was largely there to help balance out the characters on the bottom left. And I put a couple of sewer tunnels in the background so I could have some fun with water. But apart from that, I think I just placed things wherever they seemed to fit, trying to make each thing different from everything else. So now I had a framework to place everything into, but this was still just a starting point. Next was the lighting, which was super important in this picture. I was planning on making this a t-shirt design, so to start with I went with almost pure black and white to make it easier to print. That turned out to be too slow and hard to manage, so I switched over to a more blended painting style instead, which made the overall balance of light and dark a lot easier to control, because I could use different levels of grey, not just straight black or white. This was very helpful when I was still trying to figure out what the picture would be. I won't explain every change after that, since there were just too many, and I don't even remember why I did some of them, but I did have some general principles that guided me. An overall principle was to do with composition and balance. I wanted the general impression of the picture to feel right, whatever that meant, so that if something felt too cluttered, I would simplify it. If it felt too bright, I'd darken it, and so on. This principle guided me in what areas needed to be changed, and the other principles helped me to know how to do it. One of those principles was the lighting. I decided to light everything only by electric torches. Sometimes this was tough, since it meant coming up with a surface and a criminal and a police officer, which all worked to make an area of the picture lighter or darker. Other times it was easy, just putting in a doorway with a shadow. I also decided that to have the most fun with the gravity idea, no two figures right near each other would have the same gravity, so no matter where you looked, you could see straight away that something unusual was going on. A huge advantage was working in black and white with just patches of light around the picture. For example, in this version with the experimental text, I could see a bit of a blank area which I could just add light to as I needed. If I didn't like it, I could just wipe it out to black and try something else. There were some ideas I quite liked that I ended up getting rid of, including two characters from completely opposite gravities handing over stolen goods. I had a large version towards the top of the picture where there was room to put something without competing too much with the main characters, but it seemed to just hold back the overall feeling of space and balance somehow. I think that's why I got rid of it anyway. Maybe I could have kept it, but I'm okay with what I put there instead, which was an upside-down officer. This was less cluttered to look at, plus it still made the gravity thing super obvious and added a layer of depth between the foreground and the middle ground, just like the two figures had. Another thing I liked was the idea of having water flow from one tunnel into another, with a guy running behind the water in the middle. I felt this was making the most of the situation, but it was also making the background a bit too cluttered with all those bright spots, so I used the space to put in a more muted-looking officer instead. I wanted the main characters to be more fun as well. I'd made them a bit unpleasant looking, so that we wouldn't think they were just innocent victims being hunted by shadowy police officers, but it was dragging the picture down. I brightened things up by giving them expressions which were a bit more neutral and maybe not super intelligent. That seemed to cheer things up, so I decided to call it finished. And that's how it seemed to be an impossible chase ended up being possible after all. And after a few ups and a few downs, I finally caught what I was after, by taking one step at a time. I hope you found this interesting and possibly even enlightening.